Climate transition planning is a new phenomenon, and there's no real blueprint.
Hello and welcome along to this Lloyds Bank Credible Transition Plans in Practice video series hosted in association with Edie. I'm your series host and Edie's publisher, Luke Nicholls, and in this series, we're sitting down with industry leaders across business, academia, policy and investment to discuss the real-world implications and transformative power of credible transition plans. In this episode, we're going to be looking at credible transition plans from the investor perspective, understanding how institutional investors view CTPs and how businesses can use these plans to drive real engagement with the investor community. And to do that, I'm delighted to be joined here by Jane Goodland, the Group Head of Sustainability for London Stock Exchange Group, and Jonas Persson, the Managing Director and Head of Sustainability and ESG Financing at Lloyds Bank. Jane, the London Stock Exchange obviously represents a vast community of institutional investors, so you're very well placed to talk about this topic, I think. Why are credible transition plans so valuable and important for investors nowadays compared with other plans and strategies that a business may already have in place?
Well, firstly, thank you very much for inviting me here to be part of the series. I think it's a really important topic, so really happy to be contributing. And firstly, I should say that, yes, indeed, I am from the London Stock Exchange Group, which is the home of the London Stock Exchange, but we are also a very large international business providing financial market infrastructure and data effectively across the economy through the trading life cycle. But of course, the London Stock Exchange, the venue itself, is a very, very important part of the group. And it is the venue which is enabling companies to raise capital and companies from across the world to raise capital, actually, for growing their businesses and scaling their businesses. So, you know, when we look at why credible climate transition plans are so important and why they're perhaps different to other plans that companies might be preparing, there's a number of reasons why. We are in the midst of trying to address climate change and everything that means for the economy, and there's no real blueprint. This is not something we can look back in history to and say, how did we manage it last time? So this is a first. And that really is sets the context for a lot of what I'm sure we'll talk about today, which is really about organisations having to, for the first time, find ways to measure things that they haven't measured previously, to make plans in a future which is somewhat uncertain. And, while we have predictions around the way that certain climate scenarios may play out, there's not a certain way that this is going to go forward, because so much of it depends on the extent of policy transformation, how state and corporate actors might respond to the ongoing challenges. So uncertainty, I think, is something that we have to really hold as a concept that, many strategic plans that companies put together are built on fact. And many of the things that climate transition plans are trying to build in are kind of quite uncertain things. So we are in a place where it's very important for companies to be thinking through the plan, articulating the plan and engaging with investors around their particular plan, but at the same time working behind the scenes to be able to build up their information, build up their data, their knowledge and their skill sets internally to start really building that muscle in the organisation to be able to kind of think about this strategically.
Yeah, so it's about that information that matters and giving the investor community that certainty that they desperately need. That's really interesting. And Jonas, just to bring you in on this then, Lloyds Bank's reporting versus reality report discovered that 69% of investors want more transparency from corporates, while 53% of the corporates themselves believe they need to be a bit more realistic when it comes to delivering action through the plans. So from your perspective, can credible transition plans be used to connect corporate ambitions with the wants and needs of investors? And if so, how?
Yeah, it's a good comment. I appreciate there's a bit of a delta between those numbers, between investors and the corporates. Transparency is really, really important. The one data points I'd like to bring out as well is about the 9 out of 10 investors do think that corporates can do more in terms of the decarbonization and also deliver against credible transition plans, which is a big number. And equally, same proportion actually, is that investors also think they have the ability to influence and challenge corporates in terms of the level of ambition and a pace of change as well. And then you start maybe wonder, why are those numbers so high? My answer to that is that if you're an investor, you want to work with a corporate that is well advanced, have a clear and well understood, credible transition plan. Not only will it protect them against those risks of climate change, because you have the knowledge and insight how to do that, but you're also going to spot the opportunities where growth is going to be. So there's a real value proposition from that point of view. Those two are very important. The third point to that is also that those institutions that are progressing fast and are transitioning will attract the right high quality individuals that would like to work for them. They're also going to attract capital, green capital that is searching for opportunities to invest in. And that in its own right is going to increase the value of the investment of the corporates. So I think that is the answer to why those numbers are so high.
That's really fascinating. So it's about risk mitigation, seizing the opportunity, and then capitalizing on the resource benefits that this can bring. So I want to move on to then what sort of tips or advice you could give, Jonas, for corporates when it comes to really engaging deeply with the investor community to ensure they're providing relevant and compelling information through credible transition plans?
Well, first of all, we'll probably come back to your first comment earlier. It's about transparency. One thing I worry about sometimes is that corporates are a little bit worried that they're not going to get to the right level and they are over ambitious. A bit of fear to fail, I think, when you look at that. There's no such thing. Corporates should be get the opportunity, meet investors, explain what the story is, make sure they understand what the pathways they have got and how they're going to get there, what actions and what levers are going to work for them, but also make sure they have the opportunity to shine the light on where the challenges are too hard to get to on a corporate basis, so you can get help from government, from your investors, etc. If it is policy, regulation, or whatever it is required to get those blocks removed.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Jane, let's bring you back in then. So, I mean, research from CDP found that less than 1% of companies still have credible transition plans in place. What things do investors look for? When examining these plans from a credibility standpoint?
It's a really important point, and I think this comes down to the devil is in the detail. You can have a very ambitious target or plan, but if the roadmap to delivering that isn't there, or there isn't any substance to how you're going to get to that ambition, then of course there's going to be questions from investors. So investors want to see that there is a clear way forward to be able to achieve those plans. And by that I mean detailed thought and planning around the cost associated with delivering some of these actions needed to either mitigate some of the climate risk or indeed adapt to the climate risk. And we're seeing a lot more emphasis being placed on that adaptation part of the conundrum now, because of course, we need to reduce those emissions, but they're already here. So we need to start adapting to the changes in our climate that we're seeing, which is affecting the value creation that companies obviously desperately need to do.
Yeah, Jonas, bring you in on this. What's your view on it?
Yeah, no, Jane's point is really interesting, and it slightly conflicts perhaps with a data point in our survey that suggests that 80% of the corporates have or are developing credible transition plans. But it's early days. The methodology has just been adopted by a number of corporates, and we will see how that sort of pan out over time. But I expect it to get more and more efficient and effective.
Interesting. I wanted to talk about the word compliance. I mean, we touched on this in an earlier episode of the series, but how do businesses ensure that credible transition plans aren't just treated as compliance, but instead used to strike up this dialogue we've been talking about with the financial community that ultimately helps to drive annual progress?
I think it comes back down to value creation. an organisation and its shareholders or whoever's providing capital should be having conversations about how the organisation is going to manage risk and maximise opportunity so that you can think about long-term value creation. Then you put climate change in the mix. So really a company needs to be thinking about, well, how does that value creation story be affected by climate change? And how are you going to mitigate the risk and maximise the opportunities, etc.? And I think it's the organisations who are really thinking about that value creation part of the story. That's a language that investors can understand. And that has to be built on sensible information and data, measurement and metrics and targets. So investors are asking companies about the plans they have in place, but also how you measure progress, how you know that you're achieving the things that you're setting out to achieve, etc. But also how much this is going to cost. So those are sorts of conversations that really would feed into a credibility conversation and what investors should be looking for.
Yeah, the cost point is really key. I guess it's because there's a profitability aspect to all of this, an angle to all of this. The leaders that actually do develop really credible transition plans are going to ultimately potentially be securing longer term, more stable investment, right? So there's a profitability benefit to it as well. Right, last question for myself then, which was, I wanted to come back to this reporting versus reality report that had been touched on earlier. That research showed that 68% of investors now believe a company's transition plan to be important when considering making an investment nowadays. How do you see that stat, Jane, changing and evolving over time?
Well, firstly, I think we should say that that's quite a positive statistic, actually, because almost 70% of investors recognising that climate transition plans are important. So I think that's a really sort of a point to note. I should imagine that the direction of travel is up as more investors and more companies become more mature in their assessment and their creation of climate transition plans. So I would see that over time we'll see this become normalised, and the more practice that companies have at creating plans, and the more practice that investors have at analysing and challenging those plans, I should imagine this will become a normalised part of the investor-company dialogue. So that's my expectation. I think that we do need to continue to work on some of the blockers that we see for companies. Climate transition planning is a new phenomena, and it's important, I think, that the lack of information doesn't hold us back. I think it's important that we give it a go. But I think that kind of honesty with your investors is really important, to say, look, we don't have all the information, or we're still working on building the information or the data, etc. But, I think that being really clear about where there's areas that still need work and areas where there's still perhaps some work to do, I think that's okay, as long as you're clear and open or authentic about kind of some of the challenges. And we do see that a lot. From LSEG's own experience, we took our climate targets to our shareholders for approval in 2022, actually. And we felt that was really important because we wanted to engage shareholders in our plan. But at that stage, we were still very clear about saying we don't have all the answers about how we're going to achieve some of these 2030 targets. But we know the types of things that we should be looking at to be kind of building out our knowledge and our flex. So that's just one example of trying to take shareholders on the journey. And of course, we engaged with shareholders at the time. So I think it's really important that there is an active dialogue between companies and investors, which kind of balances out some of the ambitions, but with some of the challenges as well.
Yeah, and hopefully gets the statistic I referenced increasing over time. Jonas, the only way is up. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, it's very difficult to argue against that number. A credible transition plan is what it's called, really. It's an exercise and a plan over a period of time. Things will have to tighten. The bar has to rise over a period of time. As an institution, we are trying to focus on those clients that are prepared and willing to transition. We will have to do escalations for relationships where this is not happening, when there are laggards. Obviously, that pressure is less today, perhaps, But over time, that's going to intensify and the pressure is going to go up. So I expect that number is going to increase over time.
The time is now to get developing credible transition plans
Indeed.
then, from the sound of it. On that note, I am going to have to draw this episode of the Credible Transition Plans in Practice series to a close. A huge thank you to Jonas and to Jane for giving us this insight and the investor perspective on credible transition plans. Stay tuned for our next episode in this series, which is all about practical guidance on the CTP process. And in the meantime, if you'd like to read up on that reporting versus reality report, which we touched on numerous times through this conversation, please either search for Lloyds Bank Credible Transition Plans or go to lloydsbank.com/credible-transition-plans. So until next time, goodbye.